know Adrian, Johnston, and Graham Harman from yesterday, and from their being around campus the last couple of days. And we're just going to continue. We're going to we'll start with one of the questions, and then we'll see. You have. If we don't need to go in order through the questions. Let's see where this first question takes us, and then I think we'll decide on the spot. No, but we have questions there to refer to, and Adrian and Graham have both read them and prepared. So why don't you start that?
Yeah, sure. I'll start. I wrote the first question. I'll just go ahead and read it out.
Sure.
It's addressed mostly to Graham, but I'm sure that it can, inspire some dialogue maybe. So, Graham, your arguments against philosophies of access often ask us to imagine a world in which humans no longer exist. In your book on Latour, you ask us to imagine Pasteur's microbes before the event of their discovery. You argue that the microbes, like the world without us, are clearly interacting, translating, modifying, in short, being in its non-human ecology. This kind of setup usually leads the questioner asking you to escape the correlationist circle, and so on. How can you know the microbe without knowing it, and therefore reinforcing the correlation? I am not asking that specific question. Rather, I want to know what the role of philosophy is when the question of human access is no longer an issue. You have employed the hyperbolic method to evaluate mea su, and so I imagine a world wherein your philosophy has become hegemonic. What does an object-oriented philosopher do when the question of his or her position in relation to the object is no longer at stake? If the question the philosopher engages at that point is something like, how do cotton and fire interact, what would he or she do that the scientist, one that no doubt already believes that they are both withdrawn objects and might specialize in cotton and fire, would not? This is kind of picking up on some of the stuff we were talking yesterday. So
I wrote a whole page of notes in response to this one, so we
great.
try to string them together. First of all, I do miss the days when philosophy and science had something to say to each other, and philosophy wasn't simply becoming the bootlick or the handmaid of the sciences the way some people want it to be now. That seems to be the difference we have now. Some kinds of continental philosophy, they don't want to have anything to do with the sciences, so it's a division of labor. They can talk about the natural stuff, and we'll talk about meaning. And then the other people want to scientize it completely and say that we should simply be making commentaries on the sciences and shouldn't be saying anything at all about the natural world. And of course, I'm against both of those. And scientists are increasingly against both of those. I cited yesterday Rovelli and Seilinger both as saying they wished philosophy would become more bold again in talking about the actual world, the way that Einstein was able to profit from Leibniz and Mach and Bohr from Kierkegaard. Maybe that will happen again if philosophy starts becoming more bold. Who knows if indirect causation or vicarious causation, as I call it, might not be of use to the sciences at some point. And interestingly enough, I had a great discussion with Seilinger in Documenta this summer. And he, for the first time, usually quantum theory is posed in this relational way, like it proves that everything exists only in relation to even Zizek kind of uncritically takes that line on it. Whereas Seilinger said it differently. Seilinger said the way you get an object in a quantum state is by derelationizing it. So it's a lot like my objects. I was quite fascinated to hear him put it that way. I kind of suspected that before without being able to put it in words that clearly. In any case, there are already a lot of different ways of dealing with cotton and fire that don't involve scientific discourses. There's cooking and agricultural knowledge about these things. There's possible poetry about these things. And sometimes when people skeptically ask, what can object-oriented philosophy add to the sciences, they're loading the deck in advance, because what they're saying is, what can you add to the sciences in science's own terms that will add? And of course the answer is nothing. Fabio Gironi does this all the time to us on Facebook and in the blogosphere, saying that, how can we add anything to the sciences? Well, we can't if you set the conditions such that it has to be scientific knowledge. Of course we can't. That'd be like demanding that Heidegger tell carpenters how to use hammers better. Of course he's not going to be able to do that, but he's giving a different kind of discourse on the hammer that is of great use in other ways. So there is a metaphysical way of dealing with these things. You can look at the sciences as saying that everything consists of properties, and those properties must be determined by empirical means. Whereas for object-oriented philosophy, the engine of the world is the gap between objects and their qualities. And our research program, if I can use that term, is to explore the gap between objects and their qualities. That's really just true of me. Levi Bryant doesn't believe in these gaps, for example. That's my version of OP. And so my mission, at least, is to explore those gaps. And it's easy to see how this works with human things, I think. More and more I'm focusing on counterfactuals as methodologically how you do this. So actor network theory of Latour, which I think is a very powerful method, and I don't think I was mentioning this yesterday, but in Pittsburgh I was talking about how there's some suggestion now that Latour could replace Foucault within the next 10 to 15 years as the standard toolkit of the humanities, the one that everybody refers to. If Foucault's now the most referred to author in the humanities, 2.5 times more than Latour. Imagine how it would be different if those flipped and Latour were the basic referent. You'd have a lot more non-human entities. But there's a problem with ANC, which is that it's better at describing things that have already happened than describing things that could have happened. It's very bad at counterfactuals because it defines the thing precisely in terms of its relations and its effects. And there's no way really to subtract a thing from those relations and effects and imagine new ones. And I've explored this in a couple of areas, how you might do this in literary theory, as I said in the Literary History article. The Well-Broken Hammer, I was imagining a literary criticism that would involve actually changing around the text, because it's not the work as a whole. The work as a whole cannot be treated as this holistic compound, but it has elements in it that are not holistically interwoven, that they can be varied, whether it's the words or the characters or the plots. And this might be a thing to do. Counterfactual history is already well underway. It's still somewhat controversial, but it's well underway. And you can imagine this in other fields. Now, what would counterfactual science be like? Well, my contention is that it already exists. If you read Bart Bhaskar's wonderful and still very fresh 1974 book, Realist Theory of Science, which is still not exploited enough, in my opinion. That's what he says science is. Science creates counterfactual situations. And that's why realism is necessary rather than positivism. And so in a way, science already does this. I think also Kuhn teaches us about this. The difference between revolutions in science and normal science. Normal science can be viewed as a kind of Humean enterprise of just bundling up more qualities, discovering more qualities in an object that's already predefined. What you have in a scientific revolution, I think, is a redefinition of the object. A new object appears in the science. And so I don't see the paradigm shifts at all as sociological, as many of Kuhn's enemies do. As for arbitrary sociological reasons we decide to adopt another paradigm. I don't think so. I think it's that we see that the old object starts to break down, and we're suddenly focused on the object again rather than on the specific properties of it. So there's an object-oriented side to that. So the point is that, contra mea su, it's not that metaphysics is going to arrogantly tell the empirical disciplines how to function. The point is that philosophy has a global subject matter, just like a globe has a global subject matter, the Earth. And there's nothing arrogant about a globe. I mean, who's going to complain that, hey, that globe doesn't show my house on it? I mean, that would be absurd. The globe's not supposed to show your house on it. The globe is not supposed to tell you how to rebuild your deck. The globe has a different function. It has an oversimplifying function. So that's how I see philosophy's function. And again, the leading scientists want to be inspired by us. Whether or not object-oriented philosophy can tell you something about corn or about viruses that the sciences can't, probably, but I don't know what that would look like. It might not be very concrete or very satisfying.
Thank you.
Sure.
You several times stated that, perhaps in the future there would be some sort of dialogue or some sort of rapprochement between science and metaphysics. I'm just curious on what actually what that relation might look like, right? And how you might envision this kind of relationship between object-oriented philosophy and science, that if it's not one in which philosophy is the handmaiden of science or something along those lines. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, the best way to answer, I think, is that it's already happened a number of times in both directions. So you think Darwin has obviously had a big influence on philosophy in terms of the abandonment of natural kinds. Leibniz on Einstein, although Mach may have been the more direct influence. And then in reverse, I can just give you an example of each. One case where philosophy influenced science, one where the reverse happened. And it seems to me that the sciences are hungering for this right now because of the impasses that they have fallen into themselves. Quantum theory is still beset with difficulties. It's still not unified with relativity after 80, 90 years. And it seems like philosophy might be able to shed some light on that. So things like the wave-particle duality. I don't think what we should be doing is importing results from the current state of quantum theory and saying this is what philosophy should be built on. That's not how it works. I think we should be open to mutual inspiration. There should never be a handmade relationship in either direction.
For instance, do you guys have, either one of you, a sense for whether philosophy has a specific object? Is there like a specific, like an object that defines philosophy in the same way that Lacan sort of speculated on the object of psychoanalysis? Is there an object of philosophy that
so it's Adrian's turn. So I'll let him go first.
Well, my answer is very short. Just shooting from the hip here, and with all the caveats and qualifications that would have to go above the appendage, what I'm about to say. For me, the short answer is no. Philosophy does have a rather strange status, and I think it's an inherently interdisciplinary endeavor, and as such, it does not, legislate in advance about exactly what, sorts of objects they're going to be for it to take into consideration. I made reference yesterday to, being very sympathetic towards, Badiou's sort of revised version of Hegel's vision of, how philosophy is charged with the task of essentially thinking the truths of its time and attempting to look at how these different puzzle pieces that are generated in a diverse range of extra-philosophical disciplines and domains resonate with each other and what sorts of surprising implications are to be found. But I also would say that I do agree with how Graham just formulated things a moment ago, where likewise I don't think that there should be a handmaiden relationship either way. I don't think that philosophy should get involved in dominant submission games with any other disciplines and see who's on top and who's on bottom. So I'm also very comfortable with that, and I would say that in terms of this split, which I think generally is true, and especially when we're talking about philosophy vis-a-vis science, that you do seem to have now within contemporary continental philosophy those who still stick to the sort of knee-jerk, reflexive anti-naturalism that you can trace back to the start of the 20th century with, for example, Husserl's worries about objectivism and the manner in which the natural sciences were encroaching on philosophy's terrain and reducing things in a problematic fashion. But then, of course, you now have some who, in almost a counterphobic way, have swung to the opposite extreme and overcompensated in the other direction, where it's more, let's model ourselves along the lines of the most scientific forms of analytic philosophy. And I certainly, consider that to be a false dilemma and, one to occupy another ground there. But
I was going to say, I remember now the second part of my question.
Okay.
It had to do with the Badiouian concept of position. Is that what you have in mind when you say that?
yes, although I disagree with him about, I think he has a very restricted reading of, and I'm hardly the first and only person to observe this,
Yeah.
that not only does he limit it to four conditions, but even his conception of those four conditions. For example, one of my big bones of contention with him is, I think, his extremely narrow conception of what counts as science, based upon this Poirean hangover that he, I think, continues to suffer from, as do many in post-war France. But you might say the spirit of the bigger picture that he has in that he lays out in terms of talking about philosophy vis-a-vis its conditions, that I feel in general quite sympathetically inclined
Well,
toward.
it seems like the underlying premise there is that the object of philosophy is truth, and that the task of philosophy is to sort of, mathematics is the basis for, for example, philosophy turns to mathematics as a discourse on truth, but mathematics doesn't necessarily know itself as such, and it's philosophy's task to sort of restore mathematics to its status as the foundation of the possibility of truth.
Well, here I actually would say I have a very different reading of Badiou. Now, in my view, if you're to explain the role of mathematics in his philosophy, there are two things that you have to take into consideration. The first is that it's not as though mathematics is the ground zero foundation of his apparatus, because what motivates his turn to one particular sub-branch of one particular branch of mathematics is what is initially a decision of thought that is not itself mathematical. It's the axiom according to which the one is not. So he makes this move of, and according to him, this is a decision in the strong sense, in that no gut-level intuitions, no sort of assistance from picture thinking will get you to this point where you're ready to leap in one direction rather than another. So he, going back to the sorts of dilemmas at the heart of Plato's sophist, says, all right, I have decided that, the one is not. And then on the basis of that decision, what discourse is most adequate to a one-less ontology? Now, of course, he takes from Heidegger the notion that an ontology would have to be very different from any other ontic discipline, and that any ontology cannot be restricted to talking about specific this is, that's, or the others as ontic reference. But of course, unlike Heidegger, he thinks that pure mathematics is adequate to that task, that it is an absolutely rigorous rational language that nonetheless is not ontic in the sense of being tethered to content-level ontic reference. But then you would have to ask, well, what justifies selecting not just set theory, but one particular axiomization of set theory, namely Zermelo-Fraenkel plus the axiom of choice, right? He, for instance, does not opt to take Gödel-Bernays as the axiomization of set theory that sits at the foundation of the system, because that allows for, the ones or wholes that he's ruled out from the start with his initial decision. So, moreover, you would have to ask, well, why set theory rather than category theory? Because already by the time Badiou is put together being an event, set theory status as the unique foundation of all branches of mathematics is no longer unique and is, has already been challenged quite forcefully by category theory as another way of being able to universally translate all the rest of mathematics. So you have that. So I would say it's initially a kind of Sartrean style decision, a kind of existential leap in terms of deciding upon certain ground zero axioms that are not themselves mathematical, that then justify the turn to what he takes from mathematics. And that's why Zermelo-Fraenkel plus the axiom of choice is not just him arbitrarily cherry-picking from mathematics, but saying this is the one version of pure mathematics that's adequate to the decisions I've already made prior to turning to mathematics. And then, even when he's got the mathematics up and running, he does proceed in the way I think that he spells out when he talks about philosophy's relations to its conditions, where it's never just the mathematics alone. In order to extract the ontological implications from it, mathematics as a science is made to cross-resonate with the other three generic procedures of truth production. Because, of course, the mathematical language he's using, like state of the situation, is made to resonate with political conceptions of state apparatuses, et cetera. Already Mallarmé, Rambaud, et cetera, are helping him to inflect a language that he's also taking from set theory. And so he sets up this series of cross resonances, like he says, any philosophy worthy of the name does. And so I never think that I don't think the mathematics is the ground zero motivator, nor do I think it by itself has a kind of privileged be-all and end-all status, as despite appearances contrary in some of his works, and especially, of course, is best known being an event. But
my answer is that I agree with Adrian on the meta level that you can't make prescriptions for the whole future of philosophy, that it has to be about a certain thing. Nonetheless, we all have to place our bets. And my bet is that the object of philosophy is objects, and I'm not trying to be cute, but I'm inspired there by a nice passage in Kazimir Twardowski's book, On the Content and Object of Presentations, which is this kind of great pre-Husserlian work of the Brentano school, where Brentano was focused entirely on immanent objectivity. That was the move of intentionality. He was talking only about objects in the mind, that the mind has access to. This left open the problem of how those objects relate to objects outside. And it was Twardowski who made the boldest move after Brentano, saying that there's an object outside the mind, there's a content inside the mind. And I read Husserl as having shaken this up by saying that content and object are both inside the mind. They're both accessible. And so there's a tension that's within experience between objects and their adumbrations, or objects and their qualities. And so that's how I think that will be associated with Husserl's name in the history of philosophy books for centuries to come. But what Twardowski says in that passage, more importantly for your question, is that the problem with the natural sciences is that they all take a limited range of objects. They're talking about moving bodies, or they're talking about living organisms, or they're talking about chemical molecules. Some of them make the claim that all other objects reduce to those and aren't real except for those underlying tiny ones. But there are also objects in history, there are objects in the arts, there are objects in fiction, and all these things need to be accounted for simply because philosophy is the universal discipline. It's the globe. It's trying to not leave anything out, even while sacrificing detail as a result. And as soon as you accept that objects are the main theme of philosophy, and not events, I say, because events are simply what they are. They can't change into new events because they're fully determinate. So you need the objects as the surplus that engages in the events in order to allow change to happen. And so then you have a couple of dualities. You have the real and the sensual, for me, that which hides behind the event, that which hides behind our access, and then that which is accessible. And then secondarily, the polarity between objects and their qualities. And this is why, for me, there's a fourfold structure, and this is what ontology has to probe, by exploring the tensions between these objects and these qualities.
So is philosophy then reducible to ontology? There was a slippage there between philosophy and ontology.
first philosophy has always been ontology. Yeah, it's been the science of being qua being, and I see no reason to modify that. Philosophy can move into other areas too. Actually, I think aesthetics is first philosophy, because I think the aesthetic is the moment where the object breaks from its qualities. But I've got notes about that for one of the other questions. Maybe we'll get to that.
We could. I have another question then. Maybe I'm thinking of skipping to 3, it takes psychoanalysis as its theme. Graham, you often describe the basis of correlationism as the primal rapport between consciousness and the world. Psychoanalysis is often thought to be squarely in the correlationist camp. But one might argue that the primal rapport upon which so much psychoanalytic discourse is founded is actually a rapport between objects, say the mouth and the breast. It is this rapport, which occurs before entrance into the symbolic world and so on, that correlates the subject and world. This fundamental rapport is itself exterior to the domain of consciousness. Do you have any thoughts on how the psychoanalytic object, thought in this way, might resist correlationism? After all, Meillassoux' term is meant in a rigorously philosophical sense. Psychoanalysis, obviously, is in itself a practice. And Adrian, you have often discussed the dimension of the real, sometimes referred to as the barred real. Do you think this concept opens up the space for a non-correlationist thinking, Marxist-Lacanian materialism? Do you protest the term on other grounds, that is correlationism? Do you think, as my question for Graham implies, that object-oriented modes of thought in psychoanalysis, as a clinic and a logic, can be brought together productively?
You just take it in order, you go first, right?
You want me to?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, I just talked. I thought I could
No,
do
but that's
it.
fine.
All right.
I have actually a fair amount to say in response to the second part,
Okay.
so go first, please.
Okay. I don't think psychoanalysis is inherently correlationist any more than carpentry or dentistry are correlationist. It's just if you try to turn it into a metaphysics, it will become correlationist. And Freud doesn't seem to do this. I mean, Freud knows that he's talking about humans, right? He's not trying to say that there's any of this stuff going on in the inanimate realm, as far as I can tell. At times, Zizek does. I don't want to pick on Zizek because I love the guy, but I'm thinking of that passage in the Conversations with Zizek Daily, where he says that the true materialism is that the world doesn't exist. Right? It's not that there's something in itself, the noumenal in itself, that can't be. And that's a bold metaphysical claim. But then he adds, we are not idealists. And I don't know what that means. He is an idealist, clearly. So insofar as the real is undifferentiated, I have a problem with that. I wouldn't even call that a real. You could call it a realism, I guess. But realism, for me, also means that object-object relations are on the same footing as human-object relations, which means you have to have interaction between parts of the real. And the real just can't be an undifferentiated lump that's carved up by us. So that would be my worry, that I see tendencies in that direction in some forms of psychoanalysis. As far as the mouth and the breast, my only demand would be that that's a great sentence beginning, yeah. My only demand would be the rapport not simply precede the symbolic, but that the mouth and breast precede the rapport with each other. Otherwise, you can't bootstrap things into existence out of a relation, as some philosophers like Karen Barad try to do. That they say that the relation precedes the relata. I think it's impossible. How can that happen? So that's all I have to say. And Adrian, I think, has a lot.
Well, I actually, and I have a little bit more now. Apropos, and I remember you made this reference to the interviews with Glenn Daly in Dundee a couple of years ago. Now, I must confess, I forgot when I returned home jet-lagged from that trip to go, look up the exact passage again. But I strongly suspect, and this is a somewhat different version of how I responded to this initially, and moreover, it's a response which lets us return to some of the content of Meillassoux' Berlin lecture. And like you, I was rubbed the wrong way by the manner in which he was lumping together a whole disparate series of people under these headings, which I don't think were nearly as effective as, for example, his invention of the category of correlationism and after finitude. I will say that with Slavoj, I fully agree that Meillassoux misreads Hegel. And I think that it's this misreading of Hegel that is also operative in many cases in misconstruals of what Slavoj is after. Now, when he says that the world doesn't exist, I and again, I haven't looked at the specific passage, but in similar pronouncements, there are two things at stake. One is an endorsement of not an anti-realism, but instead an ontology of multiplicity along the lines of what Badiou is after. In other words, the world in the sense of the whole, a la Kant's idea of the world as per the cosmological idea of reason. So to say that that sort of global unity in terms of a single biggest totality, that does not exist. And similarly, in terms of his Hegelianism, this also has a lot to do with how he looks at the Kant-Hegel relationship. And that, of course, with Kant, if we're talking about, for example, the cosmological idea of reason, of course, we're also talking about the antinomies, in the dialectic of pure reason. And therein, of course, Kant shows that we can't resolve these sorts of issues about, whether or not, there is such, a grand whole. But of course, what Kant does is to preserve, in a way, as Hegel says, he has too much tenderness for things. That the contradictions, conflicts, antagonisms, antinomies, etc., which permeate the phenomenal field of experience, Kant spares noumenal reality those sorts of rifts and incompatibilities, and that for Kant there is, some noumenal real out there that is untouched by these inner conflicts perturbing reason as it struggles within the constraints of this side of the limits of possible experience to try and get to grips with things it can't hope to get to grips with. Of course, Zizek, even though he added some caveats and qualifications to this in Less Than Nothing, and some of these I think were responses to how I was presenting him in the 2008 book on his ontology. His fundamental move is to read Hegel as ontologizing Kantian dialectics, and to say that basically Kant was right on the threshold of the future metaphysics he wrote a prolegomena for, but by insisting upon these dialectics being restricted to the deontologized sphere of the epistemological realm as anchored in experience and in subjective cognition, he didn't take that next step that Hegel did in terms of rendering those dialectics real as very much a part of the fabric of reality itself, and hence, the world really would be broken apart by these antinomies that Kant spares it from by, at certain moments arguably resting upon this two-world metaphysics and the noumenal and the phenomenal. And of course, one of the Zizek's big disagreements with you, I think, would be that he would see you as very guilty of wanting to resuscitate the kind of Kantian two-world vision that he considers Hegel's Kant critique as having laid waste to. So you have that, and I know that that's a point of contention, but just to mark that, I think is worthwhile. And bear in mind that when we talk about Hegel as an idealist, and when Hegel self-describes himself as an idealist, it's very different from subjective idealism. And if you look at Kant and the German idealists, Kant and Fichte are subjective idealists. It's very clear that for them, yes, what we're talking about are structures and dynamics that are internal to minded subjects. But of course, Schelling and Hegel are both dissatisfied with this, and that the program that they hatch while together in Tübingen as seminary students, if you read a fragment like the earliest system program of German idealism, you get a sense of what Hölderlin, Schelling, and Hegel were coming up with, involved overcoming the anti-realist strictures of Kantian and Fichtean subjective idealism and finding a way to preserve the breakthrough of the transcendental turn nonetheless, while marrying it to a kind of Spinozism. And that remains a kind of guiding red thread for both Hegel and Schelling throughout. But the clearest place where you'll find this, though, is toward the end of the Doctrine of Being and the Science of Logic. Hegel has this extended quote-unquote remark on idealism. And of course, Hegelian absolute idealism, like Schellingian objective idealism, is not an anti-realism as far as the two of them are concerned. One could debate them on this, but Hegel says very clearly, when I insist on the ideality of the finite, this is to point to its unreality in the sense of none of these things are self-sufficient, and they are mediated by relations that they only to the the mode of cognition that he characterizes as the understanding do they appear to have an independent, fully adequate to themselves status, independent of these mediations. And for him then, to be an absolute idealist is to insist on the mediated finitude of these things, but not their reducibility to the mental. And similarly, when he talks about the infinitude of the concept, if you accept his Kant critique and that he shows the contradictions involved in the thing itself, you get rid of the idea of the thing itself. then you don't have the notion that there's something about reality that is inherently, a priori, insurmountably refractory to the expansion of knowledge. But that's not to say that knowledge ever de facto has expanded to the point to be commensurate with reality. There's still, in your terms, there would still be something that would draw us, but it's, there's a movable boundary line, and that the withdrawal can never be so absolute as to be absolutely beyond the reach of what would thereby be the finite outer limits of the possible expansion of the conceptual. And that, of course, for Hegel is entirely tied to his Kant critique that is carried out over the full sweep of his corpus. Now, as for these questions about my relationship to Marxist materialism.
And I want to reserve the right to
Kant,
respond to those.
Sure, absolutely.
Should I do it now or later?
Why don't you just go ahead and do it now? That would be good.
First of all, I agree that Zizek, like you, is often saying that the whole is not, and there are many places where that happens, but I think if you go look at the passage in the daily Zizek conversations, you'll see that that's not what's at stake there, because he's specifically talking about noumena there. Zizek is trying to contrast what he says about the world with noumena. So when he says the world is not, he's actually making a very idealist claim. And I agree
Well, he's
that...
saying noumena don't exist, but that's not the same thing as saying mind-independent things don't exist.
I disagree. I think they have to be numinal or they're not mind-independent. I don't think any of these kind of half-hearted attempts to claim that one is an idealist but not really an idealist, I see this in Husserl as well as in Hegel, just doesn't work.
Well, we totally disagree on this.
I know we do.
I think very clear from the history of German idealism how he's using the language, and I really, must say, I can't see.
I think it's very clear that the whole history of German idealism is getting rid of the Kantian in itself too quickly, and they're paying no attention to Heidegger, who requires us to take this seriously again. And I think Zizek simply asserts these points without arguing them.
Well, we'll have to leave that as I think that the arguments are, for him, run through the history of the development of post-Kantian thought in this period in Germany.
He's farming it out to them. He's letting them make the argument for him, and Heidegger has come since then, and Zizek has never really addressed Heidegger's counter-examples to this, counterclaims to this.
I think for how Slavoj proceeds in this way, there's something along the lines of, a sense of Marx's general intellect, where to some extent we can't, farming out makes it sound like, you're being lazy, whereas instead, I do think that there are instances in which, if you feel the arguments have been run well enough, and you're committed to them, and you say, well, all right, we've got this, and then what can be extrapolated therefrom, which I think, has its advantages in terms of not having to, go back and rehearse the history of the arguments each time.
I would never call Slavoj Zizek lazy. He's one of the hardest working people in show business.
Yeah.
But there is somebody named Martin Heidegger who has made critique of what he calls presence, and this would be relevant to the critique of the Kantian in itself. And I would like to see Zizek take that up more explicitly in one of his future writings. I've never seen him do this satisfactorily.
He might. I do think Heidegger plays a certain role in the Beyond the Transcendental book, but again, I only have the vague sense that that's going to be a more, that there's going to be a more sustained engagement along those lines. Yeah. Oh, well, the one thing I also wanted to bring up apropos the reference to Marxism, and this struck me when I was reading through Mayus's Berlin lecture to come back to that text again. And also when Graham yesterday laid the blame for a lot of the kind of anti-realism we have in the continental tradition at the feet of phenomenology. I do agree with that. I think that it's really thanks to the hegemony of the phenomenological tradition, especially in the Anglo-American continental world, because one thing that I encountered, and you probably encountered the same thing when going on the job market coming out of the continental department, and looking for a philosophy position, is that I'd say at least 90% of the time, when a continental position was advertised, when that was the area of specialization listed, what they really wanted was phenomenology specifically. And that the sense of, all right, with, let's say, continental European philosophy in the 20th century, my feeling has always been that there's been a kind of tacit division between philosophy departments on the one hand and then language and literature departments on the other. And that the more structuralist side of things, that the idea is that, well, that's to be left to these non-philosophy humanities departments, and then the main line of the phenomenological tradition involving Husserl, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, et cetera, that, I think that you even had a Merleau-Ponty in here at the Buffalo philosophy department, even though evidently, they and, English, Complet, et cetera, don't have much truck with each other. But that's certainly, I think, to be borne in mind, that, especially English-speaking continental philosophy has been very dominated by phenomenology, and I do think that's a lot of what's responsible for this. And for me, both thanks to that, as well as thanks to a turn in Western Marxism that happens starting with the early Lukács, and in particular I'm thinking of the opening essay in History and Class Consciousness in 1919 text, What is Orthodox Marxism? There's a footnote in there that just curtly dismisses Engels' attempt to develop on the basis of Marx's historical materialism as elaborated through the critique of political economy, to take Marx's materialism and expand it into a dialectical materialism that was interfaced with other areas apart from political economy, and especially the life sciences. You have, of course, the angles of the dialectics of nature, Anti-Düring and Feuerbach, and the outcome of classical German philosophy. That Engels is dismissed by the young Lukács as nonsense, and that you have this very standard sort of social constructivist anti-realist move made by Lukács, and to say that nature is just another concept or category which is generated internal to our socio-symbolic framework, and that this is something which itself would have to be subordinated to not a dialectical materialist but a restricted historical materialist political ideology analysis, and that line, even though Lukács himself repudiates it, and some claim that was opportunistic because he did come under, he caught a lot of flack from the Soviets over this, and he and Karl Korsch, who brought out books in the same year, in 1923, were both in hot water, and in fact, perhaps even in real danger in terms of being disappeared. But I think Lukács' rejection of that early work, and in fact he was very upset when, for example, Merleau-Ponty in France wanted to reissue History and Class Consciousness, and the Lukács who I really actually love is the later Lukács of texts such as his unfinished Ontology of Social Being, which is very fascinating to look at in this regard. But early Lukács, then Frankfurt School, etc., and Western Marxists just consider Engels the deadest of dead dogs after that. You have that both in the German-speaking world and in the France of Althusser and his followers. And I think that one thing I'm interested in resuscitating, and this is in the second volume of the trilogy, is looking at what happens when a split along these lines that has to do with Engels and a Marxist materialism that is very actively engaged with the sciences, where this split happens right at the time of the young Lukács, so in the 20s, and you have Soviet Marxism go in a very different direction than Western Marxism as far as questions having to do with the philosophy of science. And this history has been in certain ways eclipsed, and if you go back and you look at the origins of British Marxism and the radicalization of whole groups of intellectuals there, one of the main events in that history goes back to 1931, when Bukharin and a group of Soviet scientists and philosophers crashed a conference in London. They show up, and there's the second annual meeting of, it's a society for, I think, the history of science and technology. And it was mainly, amateur antiquarians, etc., who were in attendance there. And the Soviet delegation appears and gives a series of papers. And the English translation of them is available in a volume that you probably have to get through interlibrary loan. It's almost impossible to find. Science at the Crossroads. And you mentioned Kuhn. But Kuhn, what's funny is Kuhn is a really impoverished version of the paper that made the biggest splash there was by this fellow Boris Hessen. And it is an attempt on the basis of Marxist historical materialism to come up with an account of the rise of Newtonian physics as this dominant paradigm, when this occurs, during the Enlightenment period. And is well worth reading and looking at Kuhn as a kind of shrunken version of, when you look at the richness of Hessen's account. And so I'm interested in reactivating some of this. And certainly for me, the vision of the real that I'm after when talking about the material real is one which I think is, of course, very much bound up with variants of historical and dialectical materialism. And so, I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of articulating this with reference to a side of Marxism which itself lost out, and you might say, to put it in Gramscian terms, in the war of position for hegemony in Marxist circles in the West, that is an option worth resuscitating. And of course, part of why people don't want to touch it is, as soon as you start talking about Marxist philosophy of science, you immediately will be met with the version of, when you talk about communism, the name of Stalin. Well, Stalin's favored, barefoot agronomist, the Ukrainian Lysenko, Trofim Lysenko. And I think that, to trot Lysenko out as a means of saying, well, you really shouldn't mess with this, it just leads to disaster, anyone who makes that move is the same, is willing to make the same sort of move as saying there's no point talking about radical leftism because Stalin and the Gulag. But anyhow. Oh, and I should also say, I don't think psychoanalysis is correlationist, but also I have, here I'm fighting a different fight, which has to do with rejecting, for example, what I think are bad readings of Lacan, and then based on that, bad readings of Freud, according to which you have a good Freud of biology and a bad Freud of the signifier. You jettison the former, it was just a lamentable self-misunderstanding on Freud's part, not worth paying attention to, and then focus on the latter. And so, overall, I think if we're talking about materialism and realism and something which would not, which would involve a psychoanalysis, which can't just be reduced to the inner mental dynamics, of minded beings, well, yes, I think that is a part of it. And I guess maybe Graham and I differ too, because I have a little hesitation around, I think that although I don't think you can just turn psychoanalysis into a metaphysics, I think you can take some of these elements that I'm alluding to here, and there are philosophical implications which would, not necessarily lead to, just a very kind of, enclosed, subjective idealist, sort of philosophical matter.
And I just want to bring up one other disagreement that you mentioned in passing, which is that, although I do blame phenomenology for the hegemony of correlationism, I'm still very fond of phenomenology because I think phenomenology is what opened up these two kinds of tension between the object and its qualities. Husserl, despite being an idealist, does what no idealist did before him. He's the first object-oriented idealist. He's the first one who has objects populating experience itself. And I think Heidegger does something similar, but pointing to the depths rather than pointing to something happening at the surface. And so I regret the way in which phenomenology has been brushed aside by many of the cutting-edge continental theories. I understand why it happened. This especially happens in France, where Husserl and Heidegger became so institutionalized and so boring and middle of the road that someone like Tristan Garcia, this great young up-and-coming French philosopher, wants nothing to do with Husserl and Heidegger, so he goes back to Meinong as a way of doing objects but not having to deal with Husserl and Heidegger, because probably he's been so traumatized by the French academic machine, tried to crush him, and so you just can't talk about those two anymore. So I regret that. I hope they come back. I hope Husserl and Heidegger come back. And granted, many of the people who work on them are completely boring, but I guess that doesn't mean they're boring.
I have to go in a second, so I just have one question to ask Adrian. A couple of times Graham has referred to the place of the aesthetic in philosophy, and I haven't heard you, unfortunately haven't exhausted knowledge of everything you've written, but my sense is that potentially the aesthetic doesn't have the same place in your thinking in relation to all these problems as it does for Graham, and so I wonder, do you have something to say about the place of the aesthetic, or is it primarily a matter of philosophy and science?
For now, primarily a matter of philosophy and science, but not in a way that excludes, eventually you can't do everything all at once. And, I do have, ambitions of someday getting there, but, I tend to get very obsessively fixated on a few problems for a period of time, and, I have to work through those until I feel I can get unstuck from them and wander elsewhere. So hopefully, and I think one thing I can say is that given that although I'm interested in philosophy and science, I'm certainly for both philosophical and I would say scientific reasons, not in favor of any kind of reductivist version of that sort of model. That for me there is an autonomy of these other domains, such as the aesthetic or aspects of the psychoanalytic, etc. That in fact I believe that part of what I'm trying to do, here's one way to frame this, I think that would be productive, is that I want what I would consider to be a non-dogmatic and materialist argument for the autonomy of those domains, rather than, as I think as often happens, there's a sense that they are autonomous, but they're not arguments offered, and then there's a lot of foot stamping and fist banging on both sides of the divide. And if you just simply assert that no, there's this separate realm that can't be captured, etc., but you can't really come up with a model for where it came from, how it arises, the manner in which it achieves independence, etc., well, then to me, you're either just refusing to think and being dogmatic, or you're falling back on what is at least implicitly some kind of implausible ontological dualism, something along those lines. And so I want to, in a sense, provide arguments on what I consider to be the appropriate grounds for the irreducible autonomy of some of these domains. And after doing that, perhaps, maybe that very move will shed some light on those, maybe it won't. But I'll have to see if and when I get time to, focus on other problems like issues in aesthetics.
Anyone want to ask their question, read out their question?
Can I volunteer question number 7? In contrast to Meillassoux and the newly emerging object-oriented tradition more generally, Lacan contends that modern science concerns a real that is not simply exterior to discourse, but a real in which discourse as such has consequences, that is, the real of discourse itself. How does this problematize Meillassoux' straightforward external opposition between, on the one hand, subjectivated linguistic or correlationist reality, and on the other, the scientific real as the absolute outdoors of life and thinking? How does Meillassoux account for the problem of semblance, or more generally, the material effect of scientific discourse in the real? And what are the ethical and political consequences of a philosophy that cannot think the real of its own discourse?
Well, I guess I just have a few very quick things to say. I think this is a great question, but great in part because I am very sympathetic to where it's coming from, and hence, can say quite quickly that, I do think that sort of Lacanian model, which again is not just Lacanian. I mean, this, to me, is what goes back to such things as, Hegel's quip, according to which the notion of the abstract, the concrete apart from the abstract is itself the height of abstraction, and then the Marx who specifically conceptualizes what are called real or concrete abstractions. And similar to Lacan, who, echoing this tradition, at the time of May 68 and then in the 17th seminar says, no, my structures have legs in response to structures don't march in the streets. These are, I think, moves that are very much of a piece. And interestingly, of course, the sorts of problems that you're suggesting for Meillassoux are at the very heart of some of the criticisms that have been leveled against Meillassoux by Alenka Zupancic, and echoing her, relying on some of her work in this vein, Slavoj in Less Than Nothing. And there are indeed these passages in Lacan where it's very clear that for him, well, the problem is that, you might say, signifying subjectivity and, its structures and dynamics keep falling into the real, and hardly, that if we're fully immanent to it, if we're, indeed a part of it, then, of course, the more, and I think Graham, when he characterizes Meillassoux as kind of classically Cartesian, if we're more classical Cartesian, these are problems. So I, at least, am very sympathetic to the question and think that these are difficulties for Meillassoux, but Graham may have a very different perspective. I'd be interested to hear.
I wasn't sure I understood the question, but I think I'm understanding it better now. One thing I still don't understand is why you say in contrast to Meillassoux and the newly emerging object-oriented tradition, because I think this is a problem for Meillassoux and not for us. Because for us, discourse can become a real thing with real effects. There isn't a hard and fast distinction between the human and the non-human. I'm a Latourian on this point. I think you have to flatten that out at the first step and say there's just actors. They're objects for me because they don't totally act. They're withheld from their actions too. But so there's not this problem for me as there is for the Cartesian Meillassoux of crossing that boundary and saying how does something from the human sphere get out into the great outdoors? Because for me there is no great outdoors. There's just this big square where everything's milling around.
Yeah, and in a way you might say that, for me, and this is perhaps one way I could contrast my approach from Meillassoux', and Alenka also points to this too in this essay of hers on Meillassoux, which I don't know, Joan, do you recall where it's scheduled to appear? I just got it in word processor document.
Something that Lorenzo case is doing.
Oh, it's doing it in, okay, yes, and in fact, I have a piece in that same issue. It's now available online, the Journal of European Psychoanalysis, an issue edited by Lorenzo Chiesa, Lacan and Philosophy. And yeah, her essay's up there, and for this question as well, worth taking a look at. But for me, the problem isn't so much, how do we break out of the correlational circle, but rather, how does the correlational circle arise out of a domain in which it wasn't present before, and continue to operate as immanent to it in a way where that circle can't be reduced to the non-correlational, ontological real out of which it arose, but nonetheless can't be separated fully from it, and keeps, of course, being affected by and affecting in turn this larger domain. So that would be another way to frame the difference between what I call transcendental materialism and what Meillassoux puts forward as speculative materialism.
And I would say the problem is not getting out of the correlational circle, which we can't, but spreading it out so that it's no longer merely human and talking about how the various circles interact. Finitude is necessary, but it's not just a human thing.
I had a series of questions about the essay, The Spectral Dilemma, but it's very lengthy, so rather than going through all of them, I guess I'll just sort of skip to the point of my questions, if I can do that. It just seems interesting to me that he focuses on a problem there that he calls data essential specters, which are related to the problem of the horrible death or unmournable death, which he says at one point are particularly are unmournable because of the repetition of the agonizing final moments. So there is something, in these examples, of course, are death of a child, death of a mother, victims of genocide, and so forth. From a psychoanalytic perspective, obviously this sounds like traumatic memory. I don't know how to put it quite in terms that would be an imminent critique of Meillassoux, but I guess my question is, how can we understand that in Meillassoux terms? And is there some concept of repetition or historicity in this idea of the problem of the unmournable in Meillassoux?
I'll start with a detailed response to one of your questions. He actually does theorize repetition in the Berlin lecture in the second half. I'm not sure in a way that bears on your problem directly, but it's something to look at if you Google for this essay. Just Google Meillassoux Berlin lecture, and you'll find some of these websites where you can download it. And one other thing, your question C, permanent loss is actually possible. All that has to happen is for the virtual God not to return. The virtual God doesn't need to return. The virtual God might not, might never come. And in that sense, permanent loss is possible. Or virtual, perhaps. Perhaps virtual is the right term.
But would it be possible for there to be a death which could not, in any sense, even virtually return? Right. That would be ruled out by Meillassoux.
Right. Because justice requires the resurrection of all the dead for him.
Yeah. So the return from the dead is at least possible for him. It's fair to say. Yeah.
Oh, I thought you meant the non-return from the dead. Anyway, both are possible.
Doesn't he say that? There was this one line that he has, and I quoted it in my paper yesterday, where he says, everything, everything is reversible. So it seems as though not just death, but just for Meillassoux, hyper chaos in its absolutely unchecked power can, reverse, overturn, alter, transform anything and everything. That's how radical the contingency is for Meillassoux, and how all pervasive it would be, at least as I understand what he's committed to. So there could be no death that would be in principle forever irreversible, at least if hyper chaos holds. I mean, for me, I must admit, I avoid getting into trying to imagine these sorts of details, because as soon as you do, to me, it reveals some of the absurdity, right? You think about, we were talking about this last night over wine and food. You think about, well, wouldn't it be a Malthusian nightmare if all of the dead came back all of a sudden? How are we going to deal with practical things like, my God, we need to increase crop production massively all of a sudden overnight, or what, if there are injustices in terms of the animal world, and then the dinosaurs come back, and I'm not really looking forward to being chased around by Tyrannosaurus rexes, etc. And also, if I can't die, if I've been resurrected and I'm enjoying eternal life, that might be a Sadian nightmare in which I can suffer infinite amounts of pain, where I can be bitten in half by these huge carnivorous dinosaurs and then not die, etc. Just start thinking about it like, oh wow, this seems like impractical and perhaps even weirdly nightmarish. But at least it's justice. Hey, I mean, but you start having these. It really ends up like medieval theological debates. You would have to have in terms of well, just in case this improbable thing happens, we better have some contingency plans in place in case all of a sudden, the graves get emptied and we've got,
I don't think there are any animal injustices for Meillassoux.
Okay, yeah, that's true.
Humans are the only object of justice.
Yeah, so, we need a Peter Singer, follower to,
Oh,
a
it's complicated.
demonologist at the same time
Right.
to start making the speciesist arguments and then talking about,
Oh my
what about
God.
all my dead pets, I mean, some of them really suffered at the end. I mean, Fluffy was hit by a car, and, so, I mean, you start getting into these scenarios,
That's great.
and to me, it's like, at that point, you're beginning to perform the reductio ad absurdum on the material. So I just try and avoid having to even, get my mind twisted in pretzel-like knots about some of this, and I just feel if I can head him off at the pass in terms of, the initial moves that he's making, whether he can handle the first and foremost challenge that would pose a problem for him of frequentialism, whether, this really is something that, can be seen as compatible with the sciences to which he appeals, et cetera, and I don't go much further than that.
You said something yesterday on stage, and I don't know if
Yeah.
you want to say it now on the record, but it's about how you don't think Cantor's transplanet mathematics necessarily helps him.
Yes.
These people will be interested in hearing this, I think.
Yes, and I'm lucky enough that one of my colleagues at UNM is an octogenarian mathematician who was a collaborator with Paul Cohen, and in fact, he co-authored with Cohen articles for Scientific American explaining to a wider reading public the significance of Cohen's achievement in terms of the complementary proof that he added to Gödel's that showed, decisively that, the continuum hypothesis of Cantor is both compatible and incompatible with ZFC. In talking with people who have some familiarity with this material, even initially, I read After Finitude as soon as it came out in French, and I was left scratching my head. I didn't feel convinced by the argument, but I wasn't entirely confident, so I got lucky enough to have some people I could bounce this off of who were trained in mathematics. And indeed, what the problem is, and the reason why I think that the reference to Cantor not only doesn't help Meillassoux, but actually hurts him. It makes the problem, my claim is that it really does backfire in the strong sense. It boomerangs, and in fact, the problem of frequentialism is even worse for Meillassoux, thanks to Cantor, not done away with through this reference. And here's why. Now, if we were to say in extremely simple terms what one of the key contributions, what a major implication of Cantor's breakthrough amounts to, this would be the idea that you don't just have a single infinite, that there isn't just one infinity that is the greatest magnitude, the one and only greatest magnitude beyond which that there is nothing greater. But that, of course, Cantor shows that there are an infinite variety of infinities. And that, of course, the continuum hypothesis involves questions of, well, with these different sizes of infinity, how might we situate them along something akin to the number line that we have, for example, for integers. And with Cantor, I mean, let's say, that you're talking about now set theory after Cantor and the demonstration, the dual demonstration by Gödel and Cohen, of the undecidability of the continuum hypothesis. Nonetheless, even though things are left in that, in that limbo, that we can still say after Gödel and Cohen and what they do in response to Cantor, that although we can't say exactly how much larger certain infinite sets are in relation to other infinite sets, we can still say that certain infinite sets are comparatively larger than other infinite sets. Now with Meillassoux, when you start looking at what sorts of sets you could form of possible universes, based on his vision of an ontology of hyperchaos where the only law that holds as any kind of restriction is that of non-contradiction, but there's no principle of sufficient reason, there aren't any constraining sufficient reasons, that if you start looking at how many different possible universes there are, and you compare, these different universes that you could form based upon adding or subtracting different elements from Meillassoux' picture, you can actually say that, no, indeed, that the number of possible universes, the infinite number of possible universes in which the laws of physics as we know them remain the same, is of a smaller cardinality than the infinite set of possible universes in which these laws, any of them can vary in any number of ways, and also at a number of instants in time. I mean, you could even have a difference between two possible universes in Meillassoux' picture where there's one in which you have our universe, and let's just say, for the sake of argument, that our universe is one in which these laws of physics remain constant over the existence of this universe. Then you could have the smallest difference, where it would be that universe, but just say the law of gravity is altered for a nanosecond at one point in the history of that other universe. I mean, you would literally have to, those would be two different universes. I mean, it would be like Leibniz's way of talking about how God can differentiate between possible universes prior to the moment of creation. And it would have to be the case that the cardinality of that infinite set would be much larger, even though by exactly how much we can't specify because of the unresolved status of the continuum hypothesis, that the cardinal of that set of universes that would correspond to Meillassoux ontology of hyperchaos would be significantly larger than the set of universes, in which, what you had to assume was the constancy of, these laws of nature, and then you could just vary other features. And so I think that, yes, we can't think of it as with the picture thinking crutch of the image of the die being rolled. But nonetheless, you can still say that there's a way with some degree of, because Cantor makes it possible for us to say, no, there are larger and smaller infinite sets. And if we can say that much, we can say, yes, we would have to leave it in the fuzzy range of a ballpark estimate, but it would be there would still be greater likelihood that you would have this problem of chaotic fluctuation that we don't see in the universe that we're in. And hence, the problem of frequentialism is right there, rearing its head and confronting Meillassoux once again. It's as though for him, with Cantor, you just can't talk about comparing anything at this level once you've exploded the image of the die, being rolled. But no, that's part of the point of Cantor is you still can, even if, the continuum hypothesis is left up in the air.
Professor Harman, in your talk, you mentioned that there was a kind of ethical, political problem that had to do with a desire that was unacknowledged in this particular direction. In other words, that there was a political element to preferencing a certain situation of the virtual over others. And in relation to what you're saying right now, Professor Johnston, about the possibility, my two questions are: first, what possible role fantasy plays in metaphysics, if any, and what ethical dimension there is to that potential role?
This is a very good question. You want to go first, Graham, since I just finished with the Cantor?
Sure, it's a tough question. I think I was talking about something else. I think I was talking about how in both mathematism and scientism there's a political desire, the desire to be able to debunk ideologies. The desire that if one can obtain this absolute knowledge, then one can go around and knock down everything one doesn't like, and which usually means irrationality, Christianity, liberal democracy. We know the usual list. These are the things that these people want to knock down, and that's a big part of the drive for claims to absolute knowledge, I think. I don't remember saying that any particular conception of the virtual had a political desire about it, but I do think fantasy is important in philosophy. I think that's what philosophy does. Philosophy imagines impossible scenarios. Philosophy is on the lookout for surprises and shocks to the usual banal way of looking at things. And so, for me, surprise is the greatest cognitive tool there is. What doesn't fit in our cognitive schemas. Not being able to deduce logically what the truth is about everything, the way that Meillassoux sometimes seems to want to do. I've got more to say about that in response to one of the other questions, so maybe I'll save my responses for that. But I do think that Meillassoux was wrong to privilege this notion that philosophy is a deductive enterprise, just like geometry, and that you shouldn't just be describing, you should actually be deducing. He says this over and over again in his books. Why? I think Whitehead destroys this early in Process and Reality when he says this has been faultily borrowed from mathematics, where deduction is king. In philosophy, this has at best a subordinate role. The method of philosophy is descriptive generalization. It's not deduction. And Meillassoux acts as though, of course, it has to be deduction, it has to be a rationalism, or else you're just describing and you're irrational. So he sets up this false alternative, and makes it seem as though you have to choose his particular deductive model of philosophy to avoid outright irrationalism.
And yeah, along these lines, I think that this is a case in which, and again, something that I suspect Meillassoux soaked up specifically from Badiou, this is, to me, indicative of an Althusserian hangover. Now, Althusser, when Althusser rails against what he calls empiricism, he lumps together under that heading both ideology-saturated, first-person conscious experiences and perspectives of things on the one hand, and then experiences it features under the tight constraints and controls of reproducible scientific experimentation guided by methodology and, again, constrained by a number of different methodological and, you might say, institutional parameters in terms of how science works. And, I have, in being critical of Althusser along these lines and saying that this is way too hasty, used a twist on, one of Klein's, most famous essays, two dogmas of empiricism. With Althusser, instead you have the dogma of two empiricisms, and he conflates under the single heading of empiricism very different senses of experience. And for Althusser, the only way to avoid, for him the sciences, because they involve experience in a certain sense, are ideologically compromised and contaminated. The only way to stave this off is through this rationalist turn that's very much a part of French philosophical sensibilities, and that you also see reflected in when I made reference to Poiret, and a whole culture of French epistemology that goes back to Cavaillés, Lautmann, etc., and that Badiou wants to reactivate as well. Meillassoux is the heir to all of this, and he indeed time and again reveals just how much he has taken on board thanks to that background. But to me, with him in particular, the terrible irony is that you have this deployment of formalization whose background motivations would have to be explained in terms of something along the lines of this thumbnail historical sketch I've just given. But then you have the return of what Althusser himself would recognize to be, the most crude, vulgar ideology with a vengeance that then comes in with it. Because when you ask, okay, well, what are the justifications for example, the excessive privileging of the human and the disparagement of animals, the whole hierarchization of the worlds or orders, the fact that you have a very, what seems like unexamined, uncritical borrowing from, well, obviously, something along the lines of the monotheistic envisioning of, how justice would be done is the right representation of it. Now we can provide some philosophical support for this, albeit in a very heterodox, non-traditional mode, etc. It's like, again, with the Leninists, both are worse. You get, the impoverished formalization and the ideological freewheeling excess together. And so it's not to say you get, as with the Althusserian vision, the use of formalization to avoid any of those sorts of commitments. And, anyhow, that's just my impression of some of what's involved here, and some of why I have, it's fascinating to read and to watch unfold, but it also seems to me like madness at points.
You bring up Whitehead in relation to this, and it seems to me that there's actually something shared here. There's a kind of emphasis on the consistency of deduction on Meillassoux' half, but on Whitehead's half, there's an emphasis on the consistency of speculation and description, right? Whitehead's system is airtight, right? Everything in the world can be explained by prehension, by actual entities, by eternal objects, right? It seems here that both of them, even if they, from different angles, are both kind of enamored of a philosophy that operates smoothly. There is no interruption. There is no hole or gap anywhere. And I'm wondering if you think there is a philosophy that can eschew consistency, that can't explain everything, that operates outside of those bounds.
I'm not sure I agree with that reading of Whitehead, because Whitehead, it's true, he tries to be as broad as possible and cover everything, and it's a speculative philosophy tries to do, but then he makes all those hesitant statements about how puny all of our efforts are to plumb the depths of the real, and we have to constantly reframe our system in order to take account of new facts. He even incorporates Einstein's relativity, not for any philosophical reasons, but simply for scientific reasons. He says we have to take this into account, and therefore what I prehend cannot be simultaneous with what actually exists, because there's a slight delay. I think it's maybe not the proper use of Einstein, but at least he thinks he's reacting to the empirical developments in the sciences. So I find Whitehead not to be a rationalist in that sense at all, despite his mathematical background. I find him to be someone who thinks he's really groping in the dark. I see him as closer to Heidegger in that sense. He's broader than Heidegger. He's trying to talk about a lot more than the Dasein correlates, but I think he's still pretty aware of the limitations of his own system, whereas Meillassoux thinks he can deduce eternal truths. It's very clear in the Berlin lecture. He puts eternal truths in quotation marks, but he really means it.
I mean, Whitehead is pushing toward a kind of description of eternal objects, right? And God as the eternal object. I mean, Whitehead is not, he's creating a kind of formal grammar for a way of talking about the world in which nothing would escape. I don't see how, he may be groping in the dark, but he thinks that he can create a kind of philosophical system that would allow us to identify anything we bump into.
But again, I think it's just a function of his breadth. He thinks it's the obligation of philosophers to try to make sure nothing falls outside the possible application of the system. He has a very strong historical sense of philosophy. He says things like, a philosophy isn't finished until it's had 2 star members. One of them is kind of vague and broad, and one of them is more narrow and specific. And obviously he himself would have to fit in that schema somewhere. I don't know who he's pairing himself up with, but I find him very self-conscious and self-critical in terms of the success he's having with his system, in a way that I don't find Meillassoux. Meillassoux actually in person is very cautious, very perfectionistic. But what his system says is that these are eternal truths and I'm deducing them.
Yeah, he even restricts philosophy in the Berlin lecture. He says, well, so we've got this these very minimal ontological commitments in terms of hyperchaos. And then it's simply a matter of deducing from that a few of what he calls figures, which would just basically be things that we can prove through purely deductive means on the basis of that principle of principles that sits at the foundation of his ontology. And so that's it.
And they're very skeletal, as you said yesterday. It's things like there cannot be contradictory entity cannot exist because then it would have no other.
Yes.
That's one of the figures. Things of that level of generality.
That's right. That's exactly what he thinks it should be constrained to.
Everything else comes from empirical disciplines.
Yeah. Yeah, but again, as I said too yesterday, and this dovetails with the objection I made to the fact that I think on the one hand he is too faithful to Althusser, on the other hand not faithful at all to him. Similarly, with this, I think that the appearance of it being so austere, so minimal, is in some cases misleading, because he's actually importing a lot of background baggage into the picture to motivate some of the moves. And so it's presented as, I think, a very restricted vision of philosophy, but it itself does not really respect all of what would be required by that degree of austerity. Because, again, for a lot of what's involved, especially in the excerpts from Divine Inexistence he translated, there's a lot of background assumptions that aren't deduced in that way, or don't just flow directly from, hyperchaos in this deductive rationalist fashion that he is relying extensively upon. So, in a way, I feel like he doesn't even live up to, he has an image of philosophy I think we both have issues with, and then he doesn't strictly adhere to that himself, despite wanting to present what he's doing as nothing but, this very minimalist, reduced rationalist program.
It makes no difference at all to empirical theology, does he? Doesn't take any of the prophets seriously. I'm not saying he shouldn't. That's the one empirical discipline he doesn't observe at all.
I have one question for Beth and one question for Adrian. I don't have sufficient knowledge about object-oriented philosophy, but it sounds like for me that everything becomes object, like history becomes object, or maybe human body becomes object, like literal text can be object. So everything sort of seems for me is like observed under this concept of object, and I'm wondering if that's the case, then isn't this concept of object too large or becoming too loose? So it's sort of, for me, like has little sort of explanatory power, like because if there is no ontological difference between all these like different kind of, for me, I don't know, like categories just observed into this concept of object. I'm wondering how that sort of concept can account for sort of differences or distinctions, or
First part of my response is that I'm not actually a flat ontologist. I think it's a useful starting point. A good example of a flat ontologist would be the early Latour, because for early Latour, anything that has an effect is a real actor, no matter what it is. And that can mean fictional things, it can mean subatomic particles, anything that has some kind of effect is an actor. And so that leads him into certain relativism problems. Like for the example between particle physics and shamanism is simply that particle physics is stronger. It has more allies. It has more experiments supporting it. It has more funding supporting it, more people supporting it, television stations supporting it, and so that's why it's more true for Latour. And I don't agree with that. For me, there are two kinds of objects. There's the real objects and essential objects. And anything can be a essential object. I just have to start thinking of it. I can just start saying things like history as an abstraction. Then it becomes an object for me. That doesn't mean there's a real object called history. And so there are still some methods involved for trying to sort out what's a real object and what's not, what doesn't really refer. So there is still some possibility of reduction in my philosophy where there isn't really in Latour. In Latour, you always have to say that the unicorn is real if it affects people. If people have nightmares about unicorns, they're real in some sense, right? The really flat ontology, of course, is Meinong, although Tristan Garcia, in his new book, tries to make it even flatter, because he says that Meinong simply is interested in objects that are the determinants of consciousness, so he's stuck in this phenomenological paradigm of things that are objects for us, whereas Garcia tries to say you just have to have everything in there in flat. I think there will be some problems with that, but as to whether it's too broad to have any explanatory power, no, because the breadth is what gives it its explanatory power. It has a negative power in breaking down pre-existent, non-existent ontological distinctions, like the ones between thought and world. All of those things have to be treated as objects. And you can talk about features that all objects are going to have, whether they're mental or physical or any other kind of fictional, any other kind of thing. And I don't see why any gain is made for concreteness by building distinctions into the ontology itself. Like, I don't see what Meillassoux gains for us by saying there's an ontological rift between life and thought. I think quite the opposite. I think sometimes flattening things out gives you more explanatory power.
One question I have to Adrian is about, I think this issue has been addressed several times, but the proximity and tension between Zizek value position and Meillassoux position, and specifically my question I wrote down number 6, like what is the specific relationship between the contingency of necessity and the necessity of contingency? So the first, the formal position is more like upheld by Zizek and value, and especially in Less Than Nothing, Zizek specifically addresses this issue of the contingency of necessity. And then Zizek criticized Meillassoux for making the mistake of conceiving of contingency according to the masculine side of Lacan's sexualism. So universal and constitutive exception.
Yes.
By contrast, Meillassoux, I think, implicitly criticized Badiou and Zizek's position, saying that in appertaining to this state, the contingency, the principle of contingency of necessity is a kind of weak interpretation of the principle of unreason,
Yeah.
which cannot sustain itself for a while because logically it's not tenable very
Yes.
well. So basically, Meillassoux said this principle should be absorbed into the more strong interpretation of principle of reason. And I'm wondering how you see these two positions. Are they supplementary? Are they exclusive of each other or counter?
My sense is a very good question, and my tentative preliminary answer is that I think there's a bit of a two ships passing in the night process happening here. Now, when Zizek, when you have this Lacanian charge level against Meillassoux, according to which his way of thinking contingency is very much to be situated on the masculine side of Lacan's formulas of situation. My way of reading this critique, especially as Zizek articulates it in Less Than Nothing, is that this has to do, and this allows us to connect back with, if I remember correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, Graham, in your presentation yesterday, one of the things you expressed reservations about is that Meillassoux does believe there are such things as laws of nature in the strong sense. It's just that they can be altered by
Right.
hyperchaos. But while they exist for the time that they're in force, they are laws in the way that, for instance, a Newtonian mechanical physicist thought that he or she was in possession of knowledge of a law of nature in that manner. And for Zizek too, that is a problematic aspect of Meillassoux' endeavor, because, of course, one of the ways Meillassoux gets his project, and after finishing it and off the ground, is to say, Hume's problem of induction remains a serious problem that we have to reckon with. And moreover, it can't, and this is, of course, of a piece with the larger argumentative architecture of his endeavor, but within Meillassoux' system, you can't just contain it as merely an epistemological difficulty. That, once Meillassoux has established some of the other things he's after in terms of the critique of correlationism, that the Humean problem of induction, if acknowledged as a real problem, has ontological implications. But how you ontologically interpret what Hume presents as an epistemological issue, that's where I think this critique really becomes most evident in terms of what its real implications are. Because Meillassoux' way of ontologizing the Humean problem of induction is not to say that, well, because of the problem of induction, there aren't really such things as laws, and that instead all that we have instantiated in their mind-independent, objectively real status are patterns or you might say, certain conjunctions that just constantly are conjoined in that way and not otherwise, and that those hold only for as long as they hold, but they're not laws in the sense of there being, all right, those entities and events, and then behind them some sort of rule as a second-order principle that exerts a force that makes those entities and events unfold as they do and not otherwise, right? That Meillassoux opts for that vision, but just says that those underlying rules with that kind of force over entities and events are themselves also vulnerable to disruption by the omnipotence of hyperchaos. Whereas I think what Zizek wants to say is it's not as though you have that one singular point of contingency that's hyperchaos, and then everything else is necessary in this qualified sense that could be disrupted by hyperchaos, but rather that it's a different interpretation along the lines of the ontologization of Hume's problem of induction, and to say, no, that what appear to be laws are not themselves laws in that strong sense of absolutely necessitating, but are rather certain contingent patterns or regularities that unfold in this way. And here's where, actually in the Umbra Journal, the issue of the journal The Worst, the piece that I have on McDowell and Nancy Cartwright. Nancy Cartwright, to me, is at the level of Anglo-American analytic philosophy of science, someone who, along with her fellow travelers in the Stanford School of Philosophy of Science, advocates this different way of interpreting the ontological import of Hume's problem of induction that I think is very close to what Zizek and myself are also after. And then as for pitting, when Meillassoux says, well, Badiou is interested in the contingency of necessity, and I'm interested in the necessity of contingency, that's one way of staking out a difference, but I don't think that's a direct point of debate, because, when Badiou is talking about, events and their truths, he is oftentimes interested in, I think, things, and for him, for Badiou, right, that's not part of ontology. That's, you have your ontology, and then this has to do with, a theory of the subject that is not just a matter of ontology. And so I think that there is not a real debate there with those two phrases between Meillassoux and his teacher, although there might be, but my sense is that you would have to spell things out much more clearly in terms of a whole series of intermediate links. But anyhow, so to have a feminine version of, where contingency is in a sense inscribed into everything, is closer to the Cartwrightian way of dealing with an ontologized version of the Humean problem of induction than what Meillassoux offers.
I would add that Meillassoux does think it's a key difference between he and Badiou. I'm not sure I'm convinced by that yet.
Yeah.
In that interview with me, that might be what you were talking about.
Yeah, that's right. That's where he says, that's where I'm quoting from.
He said Badiou sent him a letter in which he said that's the difference between us.
Yeah, that's right. It's from Badiou, and then Meillassoux endorses that characterization. But yeah, for me, the two of them would really have to do a lot more to spell out why they think that's a head-on confrontation rather than just saying, well, you're interested in this set of problems, and I'm interested in that set of problems.
When I first heard it, I thought, what? I had to think about it for half an hour and try to figure out what the difference was, but I think...
Yeah.
I was going to say something else about the point about laws of nature changing only over time, which is, again, I want to stress that he overemphasizes the importance of time at the expense of space. even though he keeps treating this objection as though it were insignificant, it seems to happen in Meillassoux system that it's necessarily true that the laws of nature are the same in all parts of the universe at any given moment. It seems to be changing only over time, and then it seems to be changing for all the universe, because there's no, it's a universal law. And this has really scientific consequences, because we make all kinds of deductions about the fact that, if we get a meteorite from somewhere, we make certain deductions based on the fact that we presume that the laws of nature are the same throughout the universe, which they probably are, but Meillassoux, in positing this necessity of contingency, seems to be undercutting that, but then he doesn't want to deal with the consequences of it. And again, more importantly, as I said yesterday, the part-whole relationship. That, if I can jump to another question someone asked, what would it mean to have contingency without sequentiality, number 9? And this is a problem for Meillassoux, I think. Contingency without sequentiality would mean a world in which gold jewelry could be made of chocolates, or of horses and bayonets, to use Obama's example, rather than of gold molecules. The principle of sufficient reason is not just a principle of sufficient reason from one moment of time to the next. It's a principle of sufficient reason in the here and now, in the way things are composed of smaller things that necessarily compose gold molecules together, necessarily compose pieces of gold and not pieces of silver. And he has no real way to deal with that. And in that 8-page supplement after finitude, he simply says, oh, this objection is nothing. The other one's important, but this one is nothing. He just kind of sweeps them to the rug, but he doesn't. You quoted his answer yesterday, but it's not good. His answer is that it's not ancient, it's...
The ancient ancestral distinction is what he falls back on.
Which doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, the ancient ancestral distinction. So Meillassoux would want to say that, for him, like let's say that, because and here I can't believe it, but all right, I'll play devil's advocate for it briefly, but just see, my sense of how he was reasoning in his response was, all right, if you, say, put forward the thought experiment of, let's imagine that I am able to travel back in time, and I can return to the Earth prior to the emergence of any sentient and or sapient life. So, the primal Earth there, it's not populated by anything, it's just, lava, et cetera, that's it. Now, for Meillassoux, it ceases to be ancestral as soon as there is introduced into it the presence of at least minimally some kind of sentient consciousness, right? And that the ancestral is by definition that which, so whatever the ancestral is would just be whatever comes before that early moment that you circumnavigated back to. And it would be that which exists always prior to any presence of any kind of minded, conscious, experiencing being. And so I think for him it's just, okay, well, even if you come up with thought experiments about time travel, all that would mean is that that the ancestral would just recede back behind whatever earliest point it is you could travel back in time to.
But he tries to say that you can handle space differently, and I disagree. He tries to say, like the example of a vase falling in a country house where no one is there to watch it. He says, but that doesn't matter because in principle somebody could go to the house and watch it. But in principle somebody could also go to 4 billion years ago.
Yes, that's right.
So it's an artificial...
That's where the, and exactly that thing that's the response to that. I fully agree with that. And I also wanted to add to this, a couple of years ago, someone who I'm friends with who was at the time at Cornell, actually still is, but now lives in New York City instead of Ithaca. At the Theory Reading Group event that year, he came up with what I thought was similar to, you're talking about, some of these ways in which, Meillassoux just, presumes a certain number of things about the laws of nature that, aren't really argued for, and that in fact, if anything, his own insights or his own philosophical commitments seem to require calling into question. A similar sort of, you might say, tension, kind of almost performative contradiction, this friend of mine discerned apropos the archaefossil. And of course, for Meillassoux, one of the things that's called into question is the constancy of the laws of nature. But of course, with the archaefossil, one of the things that has to be presumed is the constancy of the rate of radioactive decay in order to even be able to say with confidence that indeed this fossil is, for example, 4.5 million years old, et cetera. So there's a way in which, even though it's not an outright self-contradiction, there's a tension between some of what he's wanting to argue for and then some of what he has to presume apropos the objects that he points to that are served up by the sciences. Where no, it's only if you have a constancy in terms of the quote-unquote laws governing the rate of radioactive decay for different isotopes that you can be able to say with confidence that this object can be identified through dating as having been around and preceded the existence, as far as our present best science tells us about the timeline of the emergence of life, etc., precedes any form of life and hence is ancestral rather than ancient.
Can I just point out real quick, I'm sympathetic with most of what you're saying about Masu, but at the same time I do feel like it should be brought up that there's a sort of a difference in terms of causality between the world that had to exist in order for humans to come to be in a materialist universe versus the world that exists simultaneous with humans as being. Do you see what I'm saying? Like the ancestral world is in some sense qualitatively, not just quantitatively, different than the present world because it is the world that is in the process of causally giving rise to what will become sentient beings.
Well,
But
if
that's
I'm right,
not-
he can't say that.
That's not the point of the argument. The point of the argument is what's outside of the correlates. And I'm just saying that something that's spatially outside of the correlate should not be treated any differently from something that's temporally outside of the correlate. And he seems to have this obsession with time.
Doesn't that say why it's treated differently? I mean, isn't that the qualitative difference between a spatial distance from me and a temporal, i.e. causal, priority?
No, because all that's really going on is that when he's talking about the archival, he's talking about something that comes from a time when no correlate was present, but there's also no correlate present here and now in many places. And he tries to say that's different because that's just a lacuna, and lacuna is not a serious objection. You can always fill a lacuna. But he never explains why those two situations should be treated differently. He seems to have this obsession with time, and it leads to all these problems that I've tried to point out, like his inability to talk about the composition problem of whole and parts, and the inability to prove why there should be the same laws of nature in different parts of the universe. For him, sufficient reason is all about a temporal relation, and that's not all that it's about. Principal sufficient reason is also about various relationships in the here and now, not in strung along temporal moments. So I don't think they're different for his argument at all.
And all I would add to this is that I'm fully sympathetic with your characterization of the world prior to the emergence of life, and that you have to think about it as that which precedes but gives rise to life. But of course, for me, one of the problems with Mayasu is that even though he might casually allow himself that kind of talk sometimes, under the constraints of his demonological ontology, he actually denies that there is any kind of way in which there is something in that world prior to us that contains the potential for us. I mean, for him, as soon as you start talking like that, and I don't think this is the case, and neither does Graham, you are automatically guilty of some kind of vitalism or panpsychism. And so he can't even really allow himself to say that.
By giving up
yes.
the principle of sufficient reason, he gives up the ability to make that distinction that I was trying to make.
And Advent Six Nihilo, they only appear to have something to do with emergence in any way that the rest of us understand it. But
I have a question. Just to you mentioned yesterday you might discuss the various ways in which you both distinguish materialism from realism. I know, Graham, for instance, one of your problems with materialism is atomism, right? It's an undermining gesture. Whereas I know, Adrian, you use the term materialism, but not necessarily in this kind of atomistic sense. So I was wondering if you could both maybe
Materialism doesn't have to be atomism. I mean, it just has to be some kind of reductionism, and it actually goes undermining and overmining. It goes in both directions. Because you have the atomism, the standard scientific approach. You also have this kind of materialism, the way it's being used in phrases like new materialism today. It becomes this holistic, Jane Bennett or authors I like less than Jane Bennett are using materialism in this way. But then it also, paradoxically, has to turn into kind of a mathematizing, at least in the scientific kind of materialism. And this is the sense in which Latour critiques materialism as a form of idealism, that is replacing the real with some mathematical construction of the real that never fully grasps it. And this is what the sciences are essentially guilty of in their materialism. So I prefer the term realism, not materialism. I don't see what's gained for materialism except this kind of cachet of this debunking anti-ideological liberatory projects, that make metaphysical mistakes sometimes in doing what they're trying to do on these other fronts. And so I'd like to avoid the term materialism if I can.
Well, perhaps I could begin by saying I still have, even though I am hardly someone who believes that all, let's say, descriptive philosophical theoretical endeavors have to be shackled to or even made subordinate in relation to practical, normative, political, ideology critique projects. I'm certainly not at all someone who thinks that those two things are inseparable. I do believe that you can do theoretical philosophy in a way that is independent of what we might use as practical philosophy, to stick with the Kantian style distinction here. But nonetheless, I also am, in part, due to some of my commitments to aspects of the Marxist tradition, both theoretical and practical, I am interested in the, aspects of the debunking, anti-ideology side of materialism, which is part of, I think, my motivation for retaining the term. I take it up very much in the way in which it is used by, the Engels of Ludwig Feuerbach and the Lenin of materialism and imperial criticism. Now, I think that any materialism worthy of the name is also a realism, and one of the ways in which I think there's a bit of difference between Graham and myself is that although I think that once you have a number of these domains of what I would refer to as real abstractions up and running, that those are no longer reducible to the explanatory jurisdictions of the natural sciences. I think in terms of if you're going to have anything approaching a bigger picture grand narrative, that at least on the evolutionary and phylogenetic time frames, that there would be a certain privilege to a natural scientific basis to at least be able to explain how there's the initial emergence and takeoff of these dimensions, which then become irreducible to explanatory discourses focused on what we might refer to as the natural, as opposed to things that are non, more than natural, etc. So there's that. But in addition, one thing that I should point out is that I likewise am very hostile to these so-called new materialisms, that I do not see myself as at all a fellow traveler with what's going on there. And for me, the historical roots of my disagreement have to do with the difference between neo-Spinozism on the one hand and neo-Hegelianism on the other. That most of the representatives of so-called new materialisms are ultimately committed to a sort of Spinozistic vision, and I think that that is just too flat, monochromatic, etc. And here, in the background, just as for Zizek, there's a lot that's assumed in terms of the history of Kant critique, and especially of Hegel's sustained criticisms of Kant. Likewise, for me, I think that the Hegelian criticisms of Spinoza, despite efforts to answer them by, for example, Pierre Macheclé's book that finally saw the light of translated day not too long ago, are not ultimately convincing, and that I think you see the limits of Spinozism testified to by what I consider to be, the very unsatisfactory approaches of these various forms of new materialism. So, I think you're still seeing on the terrain of contemporary materialism splits between different camps depending upon which historical figures are most influential in the background. I think that the Spinoza-Hegel gap is one of the big ones that still continues to structure things. And in this vein, of course, when you think Hegel and materialism, well, again, that's where you would have an option along the lines of a kind of historical and dialectical materialist orientation that traces its roots back to Hegel and to the Marxist readings of Hegel, and that, of course, all of the criticisms which Marx issues of his materialist predecessor, most famously in the very condensed form of the 11 Theses on Feuerbach in 1845, that charge sheet, of course, applies directly to Spinozism, because, of course, the 18th century French materialists, who were most obviously guilty of this sort of thing, were themselves all, deeply indebted to Spinoza, and were carrying out a program that, was advanced under the banner of Spinoza's name. And so I think that's also just, in terms of some of the background of getting a sense of how these differences and splits even within, self-identified materialist camps look like. That, for myself, for, Zizek style of materialism, etc., it's a materialism that does, I think, allow for an unevenness of weighting in terms of what sorts of discourses are more important than others, and certain disciplines having certain prides of place and not others. but ultimately is still committed to, in a good historical dialectical materialist fashion, an opposition to reductivism, eliminativism, mechanical materialism, Spinozisms, etc.
Can I ask another question about object-oriented philosophy and psychoanalysis? What they have to teach each other?
Okay.
So I'm referring to question 8, and this is a question for Adrian, but it could also be reversed. How should we understand the kind of psychoanalytic, anti-philosophical forcing of thinking with regard to object-oriented philosophy? Is it part of an ethical practice intended to destabilize and renew the discourse of the university from within, that is propaedeutics to the formation of the analyst? And if not, how does it avoid succumbing to the eternal dream of the history of ideas, namely the belief in the possibility of accumulating knowledge? So what does object-oriented philosophy have to teach psychoanalysis? And we could reverse this as well. What does psychoanalysis have to teach object-oriented philosophy?
As far as what object-oriented philosophy can teach psychoanalysis, my approach on these sorts of questions is usually to wait for people to tell me what they've learned. Because, for example, I get contacted by disciplines where I never thought there would be any interest at all. It started with art and architecture coming in droves to object-oriented philosophy. And I'm still not always sure what they're taking from it. You can see they're taking something from it. And steamboat archaeology was another one that just blew me away. This guy doing steamboat archaeology was using object-oriented philosophy. I can tell you what object-oriented philosophy got from psychoanalysis, though, and that probably started with my very long, passionate readings of Freud when I was fresh out of undergraduate school, right before I started graduate school. And one way to characterize object-oriented philosophy is it's this kind of translational philosophy. That's really the essence of it. The idea that nothing is ever fully translated in any relation. And it's like Latour. Latour is also another of these translational philosophers. The difference is Latour, a thing is its translation. There's nothing hiding behind the translation, whereas for object-oriented philosophy, a thing is always more than its translation. It always exceeds any possible translation you can make of it. And what is Freud, if not one of the great translation theorists of all time? The dreams, the parapraxes, symbolism of all kinds, cultural constructions. It's all about translating things into different forms. And so that's probably what set me up to appreciate Latour so much later.
Mm.
Yeah, this is again, I think Graham's initial inclination in terms of how to respond is very similar, and I haven't really had a chance to talk to him a great deal about psychoanalysis directly. I mean, most of what, in terms of our exchanges, centered around history of philosophy and contemporary issues is informed by that. So I know that, of course, one of his, I actually have known for a long time, one of his, I guess it would be fair to describe Levi as a collaborator.
Yeah.
And Levi and I first met actually through Lacan conferences going back 10 plus years, and when he was much more focused on psychoanalysis. And I think his work does a lot of labor towards exploring what this kind of approach, even though different from yours, how it interfaces with Freudian and Lacanian traditions. Now, after the past 2 days, I think that, and it might seem like a very simple thing to say, but I think nonetheless it's an important point, and it's one which has only snapped into focus for me, in these 2 events here at Buffalo, which is that I think for psychoanalysis, it is absolutely essential to treat things which, for example, a reductive scientific discourse would view as epiphenomenal, illusory, fully eliminable, etc., and to say that these things are on the one hand not ineffective fictions, but on the other hand, they are not just internal contents of first-person consciousness and self-consciousness, that there is this in-between realm that is not satisfactorily captured by many approaches of, you might say, and and here another Zizek reference just pops to mind, but he talks about the difference between the subjectively objective and the objectively subjective, right? And what he's trying to get at similarly with that distinction is what I think I have in mind here, in terms of the idea of there can be these, to use the term, objects that are on the one hand not just properties of material bodies that can be dealt with in terms of precise Galilean quantification and that can be mapped according to explanatory strategies mobilized in the category of efficient causality alone, but that these are not, for instance, like the correlates of consciousness dealt with by certain varieties of phenomenology, etc. And so, how would you account for not just real abstractions, but those real abstractions which bed down in our being and that operate especially at the level of what we call the unconscious, that can't be subjectivized, can't be directly identified with by first-person conscious awareness, and that they're real. And I think that some of, there are many sides to the Lacanian real, as we all know, and it's an incredibly slippery, complex category. And along these lines, I would highly recommend a new book which has come out by Tom Ayers, Lacan's Concept of the Real, which does a very nice job of tracking all of the different senses of the real in Lacan. That some of what Lacan is after when talking about the real is trying to talk about this peculiar category that often is not done justice to, but that is absolutely crucial for psychoanalysis to be able to affirm. And the sense that I get is that there is some common ground here in terms of some of what Graham is interested in affirming and some of what I think is central to psychoanalysis in this vein, if that helps. Time for a little more.
Let Martin Hegland off the hook so far.
Well, you know what I will say about that?
Yeah.
There's something that occurred to me, and with Martin, one of my big complaints about him, and I've openly aired this in several debates with him. Now, Martin, in terms of the law of non-contradiction, the only place where Martin suspends that is when he is talking about how we have to think of the present moment of the now in order to have an account of time that does justice to the temporal. But after that, everything else, Martin argues like a very traditionally trained analytic logician or metaphysician. And he rigorously respects the law of non-contradiction in terms of his reasoning very much being something which is skeletally structured by a classical bivalent logic for which the law of non-contradiction is absolutely central. And part of why I think he ends up not being able to do justice to the unconscious in his engagements with psychoanalysis is that Martin is a thinker of secondary process mentation, if we want to put this in Freud's vocabulary. Secondary process thinking to him is just inconsequential, illogical nonsense and hence unreal. And so he is, in a way, you might say, too smart for the unconscious. But I would just say that with Martin, like with Meillassoux, and the idea that there's this one point of exception of absolute contingency, and then everything else, is necessary, save for being subjected to the possibility of disruption by hyperchaos. Similarly, for Martin, there's this one point of suspension of classical bivalent logic when thinking a certain model of temporal succession, and then everything else in terms of how he deploys arguments on the basis of that very much scrupulously respects classical bivalent logic with its law of non-contradiction.
I think Martin is simply too loyal to Derrida on this point. I've got a couple of complaints about how he handles this. First of all, I've written at length about Derrida in White Mythology in my book, Real Metaphysics, where I say that he misunderstands Aristotle. Aristotle defends the law of non-contradiction. This does not mean that Aristotle is enforcing univocal uses of words, and Derrida tends to conflate those two. So when Aristotle says things like, anyone who sits on a cliff instead of jumping off, or who takes this road to go to Megara rather than the other road, anyone who doesn't do that is no better than a plant. And Derrida reads these sinister political implications into this that simply aren't there. Aristotle's simply having good fun. Aristotle's simply trying to say that the thing is what it is. It can't be everything. If a thing were everything, then everything would be everything else, and you couldn't think at all. And that's a perfectly good ontological point, I think. I'm with Meillassoux on this. But then Derrida misinterprets that as meaning that Aristotle's this cop who wants to force us to use only certain meanings of words, and he's going to be an imperialist who... No, Aristotle says that metaphor is the greatest gift. This is not a cop of language at all. And how this cashes out in Martin is that, Martin Hegland, that is, let me complain first about Derrida's reading of Heidegger. Derrida starts the grammatology by saying, isn't it great that Heidegger critiques presence, and so do I. But then Derrida adds this thing that isn't there in Heidegger. Derrida says, identity is just a form of self-presence, and so therefore identity is a form of presence. No, identity is not a form of presence. Presence has to do with relationality, if you read Heidegger carefully. Presence has to do with being present in consciousness, or being present in spatial temporal coordinates, or being present as a stockpile for someone to use. Presence does not mean identity for Heidegger. It's perfectly fine to have identity in Heidegger. The thing is what it is. Deeper, being is what it is. And then Derrida says, just as for Heidegger, there's no being apart from its historical manifestations. That's nonsense. That's not Heidegger. That's Derrida. Derrida invented this. It's a figment of his imagination. And Martin, to me, moves too much in this direction. That he says that, what do I have here? Martin also treats identity as a form of self-presence, and therefore is something bad. And then he illegitimately calls that time. How is it time just because a thing cannot be pinned down identically? You need some extra element to get time, I think. I don't think that Martin ever talks about time. But in all fairness, I don't think Heidegger ever talks about time either, but that's for different reasons. Heidegger's philosophy works perfectly well for a frozen instant. Heidegger's temporality is about a threefold ambiguity between past, present, and future. And if you were to freeze time in its tracks, Heidegger's analyses would still work. Ecstatic temporality would still be there. You don't need things to move for Heidegger's time to work. Contrast that with Bergson and Deleuze, for example, where the becoming comes first. And only as an abstraction can you slice it into individual moments. And it seems to me that Martin makes the usual mistake of interpreting Heidegger as though he were Bergson, and the Derridian reading of Heidegger as though Heidegger were Bergson, as though Heidegger were already implying that the threefold temporality Heidegger talks about is also time in our usual sense of movement. So I don't think that's the case. In other words, I don't think Martin ever gets the time, despite his constant use of the term.
But at the same time, I remember the question that contains the reference to Harman, does pose, I think, a very interesting query about, for Graham and myself, what the status of the law of non-contradiction is, for us philosophically, and I think that is, quite a big issue, and I don't know if, you want to, both of us to make forays into that or not. But,
well, you're probably going to differ from this because you have more Hegelian aspects than I do, but I absolutely endorse the law of non-contradiction and the principles of sufficient reason. I think you have to have both of those. I'm not sure I have much more to say about that.
I've got to say that I am, I at this point would hesitate to answer definitively because yes, given some of my Hegelian commitments, on the one hand, I don't think that one could so easily dismiss Hegel for just projecting contradictions in the logical sense into reality. But of course, when Hegel uses the term contradiction, I mean, oftentimes he's talking about what, frequently critics who go after Hegel for this will return to the pre-critical Kant of his 1763 essay on negative magnitudes, and will have recourse to Kant's distinction between contradiction and opposition and say that the real can only contain the opposed, but there can't be contradiction. So contradiction can only be logical, and as logical is internal to the space of, we might say, to use a Salarzian term, but it's the space of reasons. Now, with my Hegelian commitments, what I will say, and this is a restrained, minimal, almost, courtroom cautious sort of answer, but I would say that we can't, at least, and this leaves undecided the issue of is it epistemological or ontological, but at a minimum, we cannot do justice to the real without a much more flexible form of logic than what is allowed for by what Hegel calls, Verstand as opposed to Vernunft, by classical bivalent logic alone. That we need a much more elaborate array of logical machinery that would involve logics, and there are, of course, also even just within the world of symbolic logic, non-classical logics, which, of course, took off after Hegel, and it would be interesting to see how he would respond to the history of logic and mathematics, from the mid-19th century onward through today. But I think in order to really get a handle on the real in all its richness, that at a minimum we need to allow ourselves not to be completely shackled to the law of non-contradiction. That would be all I would say for now.
Can I ask one last question? It's for Graham, actually.
Okay.
It's more of a practical question or a compositional question.
Sure.
I'm curious as to why, given your weird realism, right? And how, given your weird realism, your rhetorical and compositional practice as a writer of philosophy remains so clear, right, and so direct, right? There is a certain directness of that in language that you deploy. This relates to your understanding of Lovecraft's encounter with weird realism or kind of instantiation of weird realism, right? We could relate Lovecraft to Stein, whose Tender Buttons is also engaged with a kind of new approach to the real, and we see there that representational language is short-circuited. Tender Buttons is not Lovecraft, right? Lovecraft his cubism tends to simply remain within this kind of descriptive frame in which things are described as having more sides than they should, rather than language itself becoming weird. And I'm interested in how you see your relationship to this new understanding of the ontological, this weird realism, and yet this kind of, I don't want to say standard, but a very classical approach to rhetorical maneuver in which metaphor remains the spice of philosophical language.
Right. First of all, the term weird realism, in case anyone isn't familiar with it, is simply, that term was coined because realism usually refers to this boring middle-aged doctrine where there's a world outside the mind and we can copy it without equation. And as I've often said, realism is to philosophy what health inspectors are to restaurants in the eyes of most. It's just there to come and slap people down and tell them they're being too imaginative and getting off the highway. No, all the speculative realists had realism was fairly weird. And Meillassoux, even in that transcript, said, yes, we're all weird realists. And it goes along well with Lovecraft. I wasn't aware that my prose style is classically direct. I think I try to be clear. One of my objections to talk about writing is the excess focus on clarity. For example, analytic philosophers will insist on how clear you have to be, as though the only problem with prose was that it was too muddled. And if you think about it, analytic philosophy prose tends to be very clear, but it's often very hard to follow anyway. It's often very boring anyway. Why is that? It's clear, but it's not vivid. And so somebody need more vivid writing. Jerry Fodor wrote that absurd article in the London Review of Books, maybe, where he said, why do people buy more continental philosophy books? Most of us are better writers than Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, he mentioned. Which, how on earth is Jerry Fodor, by any standard, a better writer than Kierkegaard or Nietzsche? Why? How many good writers are there in analytic philosophy? Maybe Wittgenstein, if you like that kind of thing. And then after that, it's just this sort of prosaic.
We were talking about, although there's more, his spoken style, but he is beautiful, I think, to read.
Kripke, I really enjoy reading. That's right. But there aren't that many. They're few and far between. So I try to write vividly rather than just clearly. But I think clarity in the prose, which some of our star continental theorists in the last 50 years have not always observed, helps preserve the weirdness of the reference, I think. So it's a way of getting the reader not to focus on your prose. You should be hiding. Right?
That's what I mean by that seems to me a very classical definition of rhetoric does.
Okay.
Right? It allows the reader to pass through language. Language itself is not affected by the weirdness of reality. Right? Reality remains weird. You just get there. The reader is just transported.
Right.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, you see this, for example, in Kafka, who doesn't make many technical innovations compared to Proust and Joyce. Isn't that interesting? And yet he has a weirder vision than they do somehow, despite using more normal prose. So I have no problem with preserving these classical aspects of rhetoric. Do you? Do you think there's a better way to do it?
I think there is a way in which, if one is talking about the kind of weirdness of reality, and yet language is not affected or touched or in any way distorted as it's used in its encounter with this reality or as a part of this reality, as one object among others, it seems that language is afforded another status altogether as simply a vehicle in this instance.
What about, do you think Lovecraft does that though?
I think Lovecraft is actually, he uses standard kind of, aspects of representational language to indicate the ineffable, right? And you point this out constantly. Something is beyond description. Something defies description, right? There's no attempt to kind of ask what the weirdness of description itself might be. In the case of, say, like a Stein, who tries to describe a bottle and ends up writing, the 5 pages that have everything to do with everything else and not the bottle, and these weird cubistic syntactical constructions.
Right.
I'm interested in that difference. And Stein herself called herself an empiricist, right?
Yeah.
She was an empiricist, or she was a realist, and a radical realist.
Even though I don't write like that myself and never would, I love reading Stein.
Yeah.
maybe she's due for a comeback.
She's already going through.
Through it? Okay. I wasn't aware of that. Okay. But Lovecraft, the language is distorted by the thing in a sense, too. So I guess I'm backing away from what I said earlier, that it's simply a vehicle. I see your point. The language is distorted. It's simply that it's not annoyingly self-reflexive and...
Okay.
Certain peak of self-indulgence along those
Yeah.
lines. that you reach this-
So that's what this is, you're equating, okay.
Well, I think within
Aesthetic
certain,
experimentation.
in certain continental philosophical circles, I do think it is fair to say that things went a bit too far.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Allow certain stylists for a little too long.
I like the back voice.
Yeah, I think we've used them up as much as we can.
Yeah.
Okay. Good.
Well, thank you.
Thanks.